Miss Ox, I understand that there are extenuating circumstances in your situation. However, I think you will agree that your continued presence at Consolidated Oil and Gas will create awkwardness for both you and your colleagues. Based on this, we believe that the best decision for everyone would be to terminate your employment for personal reasons. If you decide to do so, we will of course be happy to provide you with a reference and a good reference for your future employer. When the HR representative spoke to me, I couldn't help but tense up. I just got fired, I realized, and although I expected this, my eyes began to fill with tears. Don't cry, I fiercely ordered myself. Whatever you do, just don't cry. Having signed the documents that were handed to me, I slowly walked back to my workplace. It took very little time to collect the personal items that I had hidden in drawers and on shelves, and now I was walking down the corridor with a pathetic little box in my hands. I didn't know whether to be sad or relieved that none of my colleagues were around to see me off. To tell the truth, I was glad that Jerry wasn't there, but I would have liked to see Buffalo Bill at least one more time. But I knew where he was, and besides, considering that he was probably thinking about me now, maybe it was even better. Suddenly, a terrible thought came over me. What if I ran into Kurt Jorgenson? This frightening idea made the tears flow even more, and I hurried to my old Toyota to go to my small apartment. As soon as I got there, I hurriedly started packing my things. It took very little time. In the few months that I lived in this apartment, I probably spent no more than a few weeks there. When you work as a field auditor, you don't get much stuff. I bet some truck drivers spend more time at home than I do. However, now all this is behind us. There was only one thing left to do, which I kept putting off. Mom, this is Annie. Mom, can I come home? And with these words, to my utter embarrassment and chagrin, I began to sob. When I managed to pull myself together, I dropped the keys and the current month's rent in the rental manager's mailbox and headed to Tyler. It's only about 200 miles from Houston to Tyler, but it's like they're separated by a continent. As I drove north on I-45, I couldn't stop myself from remembering everything that had happened. I remembered sitting outside Kurt Jorgenson's office on the first day of my new job. I was both excited and nervous. I was finally going to meet my first boss at my first real job. Not a summer job or internship, but a real one, and not at just any company, but at Consolidated Oil and Gas, one of the largest energy corporations in the world. Of course, I did well at the University of Texas at Tyler and did even better on the CPA exam. But I never thought that I could get a job in a large corporation. I was more or less ready to do the accounting for my parents' pink business in Tyler. Tyler is the rose capital of the world, and my parents spent their entire lives growing roses. Although I had doubts about my prospects, when I learned that Consolidated would be recruiting students on our campus, I decided to take the chance. Somehow they chose me for a second interview in Houston. When I was actually offered a job, I knew that if I didn't accept, I would regret it for the rest of my life. So here I was, ready to get to work. Officially, I had already been listed as an employee of the company for several days, but this time was spent on orientation, registration of benefits, and other introductory activities. Now I was ready for my real work assignment. I thought I'd be working somewhere in Consolidated's extensive accounting system, so I was a little disappointed to learn that I was assigned to the field audit team. Accounting itself is already boring enough, but auditing is even further removed from real business. Essentially, this is simply a review of the work that other accountants have already done. But I had no opportunity to argue, so I waited patiently outside the office door to meet with Kurt Jorgenson, one of the directors of the field audit department and my new boss. When his secretary invited me into his office, he rose from the table and invited me to sit in one of the chairs opposite him. He was a distinguished man, taller than me, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair neatly combed back. Although many of the directors I saw at the company wore more casual clothes, he was wearing a suit, white shirt, and tie. His appearance and demeanor conveyed a sense of power, even command. "Miss Ox," he began as I sat down, "the goods we mine, process, and distribute are vital to the economies of many countries around the world. A shortage of oil or gas can paralyze national economies and topple governments. Our financial results are eagerly awaited on the leading stock exchanges, not only because of their immediate impact, but also because they are considered a harbinger of the economic future. As a result, our corporation is closely monitored and regulated, and our financial statements are carefully audited. For these reasons, it is important that every company transaction is accurately documented and consistently reported. Moreover, all transactions must strictly comply with generally accepted accounting principles and consolidated oil and gas standards. The mission of corporate auditing is to ensure that these standards and procedures are applied consistently and evenly throughout the corporation. You are now part of a team tasked with this important mission. Are you ready to take on this responsibility? I swallowed. Oh, yes, sir, I replied. I'm very ready. Very good, he said. I expect nothing less than perfection from you. With these words, he called the secretary and asked her to take me to the rest of the audit team. Following her, I tried to collect my thoughts. What an impressive man, I thought. He made our work the most important in the company. I was still trying to comprehend my interview with Mr. Jorgenson when the secretary led me into a small room divided into 3 offices with a conference table and chairs in the center. She took me to one of them and introduced me to Jerry Higgins. Jerry is our accounting systems guy, she said. Jerry seemed familiar to me, not because I had met him before, but because he reminded me of many of the math and accounting students I knew at Tyler. He was of average height, but the buttons on his shirt were barely big enough to contain his bulging belly. He clearly needed a haircut. Another math nerd, I thought to myself. Then I smiled internally, same as me. I introduced myself to him and asked about his role on the team. Those were the last words I spoke for the next half hour as Jerry began a long, technical description of Consolidated's corporate accounting software. As he continued, I couldn't help but remember the students I'd met in college who looked like him, especially Tom. Tom and I dated for almost half a semester in our 3rd year, and it was with him that I had my first sexual experience. It turned out to be quite an awkward and unsatisfying experience, and I was disappointed that the sex wasn't as great as everyone said it was. After Tom, I didn't really date anyone. Well, what do you think impressive, huh? Jerry asked. I snapped back to reality and tried to look excited, nodding. I didn't have the slightest idea what he was talking about. Well, I guess I should introduce you to Buffalo Bill, Jerry continued. Buffalo Bill? I was surprised. Who is this? Oh, this is Bill Hitchcock, another member of our team. Everyone calls him Buffalo Bill, Jerry explained. Oh God, I thought. What have I gotten myself into? When we approached another office, Bill must have heard our steps, because he stood up and immediately extended his hand to me. Hi, I'm Bill Hitchcock, but everyone calls me Buffalo Bill. What's your name? Hi, I'm Ann Ox, I replied. Where are you from, Ann? He asked, and when I said I was from Tyler, Texas, a smile appeared on his face. He said, Ann Ox from Texas doesn't fit at all. I'll call you Annie Oakley. I squinted to see if he was making fun of me, but his smile was so open and his laugh so contagious that I couldn't help but smile back. The truth was that I was secretly flattered. As a child, other children called me Orphan Annie, so I actually liked Bill's new nickname. Okay, I'll be Annie Oakley if you tell me why they call you Buffalo Bill, I replied with a smile. Of course, said Bill, that's my usual way of agreeing. Actually, Bill continued, there is no special story behind my nickname. I was attending the University of Colorado, and one day I was assigned to work with the university's mascot, Ralphie the Bison. We took him around the stadium at all the football games. One day Ralphie got excited and rushed forward. All the other guys who helped guide him fell and let go of the lasso. I was the only one who could hold on, and ever since then they call me Buffalo Bill. I couldn't help but smile as I imagined Bill being dragged across the football field behind a real bison, but I was worried about my new job, so I asked him to tell me about his responsibilities as an auditor at Consolidated. While Bill spoke, I listened carefully, but at the same time I tried to figure him out. If Jerry was a typical nerd, I guessed Bill was probably the student body president of his college. He was tall, even taller than me, and handsome, with a shock of blonde hair and blue eyes. He must have broken a lot of hearts, I thought with envy. But I couldn't help but feel a little disappointed when I looked down and noticed the wedding ring on his left hand. "Stop it," I sternly ordered myself. "He's still not interested in you." When he finished talking about his duties, Bill asked me about my life. "Nothing particularly interesting," I replied. "I was born in Tyler, lost my parents, and lived in a shelter for some time. My adoptive parents took me in when I was 13 and raised me. They wanted me to study more closely, so I went to Tyler. Initially, I studied at the Faculty of Mathematics, but my father convinced me that there were few prospects in this field, so I switched to accounting. 4 years later, I received my CPA degree and certification and ended up here." "You got your degree and passed the CPA exam in 4 years?" Bill was surprised. "You must be very smart. It usually takes at least 4.5 years. "Well, since I lived at home, it was easy for me to take summer courses and finish early," I explained. "We're lucky you did that," Bill said. "The audit department usually hires a whole new team at the same time. 6 months ago, we had another woman on our original team named Betty Murphy, but she left after a few months, so we were working short-handed before you arrived." "Why did she leave?" I asked curiously. "I don't know," Bill replied. "She was here one day and gone the next day. I think she just didn't like working here." So what's it like to work at Consolidated?" I asked him. His eyes sparkled. "The first thing you need to know is that only the bosses call the company Consolidated. Everyone else just calls it COG. I guess that makes us little cogs in the big cog," he said, smiling wryly at his own joke. I rolled my eyes. "Okay, what's Mr. Jorgenson like?" I asked. "He's very demanding, a bit of a perfectionist," Bill replied. "But if your work is done correctly and on time, you won't have any problems with him." Just like my father, I thought to myself, or Professor Hunter from Tyler. That last thought made me blush slightly. I had a slight crush on Professor Hunter. Nothing happened, of course, but apparently I was attracted to strong and strong-willed men. "What do you think about Houston?" Bill asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. "It's so huge," I replied. "It's a little scary." Bill looked at me curiously. "Have you never been here before?" Now I'm really blushing. "No, I've never actually been anywhere other than Tyler. My parents always wanted me to be closer to home." Bill's face showed surprise for a moment, but he quickly replaced it with his usual open smile. "Once you get used to it, I think you'll like it. It was difficult for Denise at first, but now she's starting to get used to it." "Denise?" I asked again. "Denise is my wife," Bill said. He turned to his desk and picked up the photo. The photo was of a beautiful young woman at some kind of celebration. She was probably the head cheerleader, I thought to myself. Out loud I said, "She's beautiful." "Thank you," he replied. "I think so too." "Okay, I'll show you your office," Bill continued. "Hey, Jerry, how about helping Annie Oakley set up access to the corporate network?" This is how my first days in the audit team passed. At first, I was a little wary of communicating with Buffalo Bill because I never felt comfortable around popular guys. But he turned out to be really open and sincere, with a great sense of humor. Jerry was still a nerd, but once you got to know him, he wasn't a bad guy either. Only Mr. Jorgenson remained distant and unapproachable to us. In addition to working in close company, Buffalo Bill, Jerry, and I regularly ate lunch together. We were one of a dozen audit teams in the field, and the company encouraged close communication within the team to promote good working relationships. At the same time, we were discouraged from getting too close to other employees of the company, since in the future we might have to check their work. One day, when Bill was away on business at lunchtime, Jerry and I were eating together at the conference table, and he asked me, Are you going to the company picnic? Which picnic? I was surprised. I don't know anything about him. Well, it's next weekend, Jerry said. It's a big event. All the important people from the company will be there, and we're all expected to come. The company rents out an entire amusement park for the day. It's a lot of fun. He looked at me slyly. So are you coming with a guy? I blushed. I don't have a boyfriend, I admitted. Great, he said triumphantly. Then come with me. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. I got myself into this. Jerry, I don't think that's a good idea. Jerry's face darkened. I see, he said sarcastically. I'm not good enough for the hot girl. Not good enough? Hot girl? What is he talking about? I was perplexed. But I needed to say something, so I started babbling. No, that's not the point at all. I'm just not dating right now, and besides, it could affect our working relationship. Luckily, Buffalo Bill returned at that moment and joined us. Even though Jerry was clearly upset, to my relief, there was no further discussion of the picnic or dates. After lunch, I returned to my desk, but kept thinking about this awkward situation with Jerry. To be honest, I didn't have much experience with guys, and I didn't really know how to handle these situations. Well, gee, I did it. Besides, why did he even decide to invite me? For that matter, I was definitely not a hot girl. In the end, I decided that Jerry probably doesn't date girls very often either, so he would be attracted to any female, even me. I looked at Buffalo Bill's office and saw a photograph of his wife on his desk. This is a really hot girl. When the weekend came with that same company picnic, I seriously thought about whether it was worth going there. I didn't feel good socially, and there would be no one other than my colleagues there for me to talk to. However, I didn't want to ruin my reputation by missing an important corporate event, so I reluctantly decided to go. I checked with Mr. Jorgenson's secretary several times, and she assured me that the dress code for the event was very casual. Accordingly, I put on an old pair of jeans that hid my gangly legs well and my big white Houston Astros jersey. I hope I didn't stand out. When I drove up to the amusement park in my old Toyota, the picnic had already begun. The invitation promised free tickets to all the attractions, as well as plenty of beer and barbecue, and the event was already well attended. I would imagine that on such a hot day, the main attraction was the beer. After I showed my employee ID, the girl at the entrance asked me to fill out a name badge. Hi, my name is Ann Ox, I wrote and pinned the name tag to my t-shirt. As soon as I entered the park, I was approached by one of the hiring managers who had been involved in my hiring at COG. It's a good thing he also wore a name tag, otherwise I wouldn't have remembered his name. Apparently, he didn't remember my name either, because he kept staring at my badge. Hello, Miss Ox, he said, mispronouncing my last name. Many people do this. Hello, sir, I replied, pronounced oaks like trees. Got it, he said. So how do you like working at Consolidated, Miss Ox? I decided to ignore the fact that he again mispronounced my name, and he continued to ask me questions about the company that, in my opinion, meant nothing. The whole conversation seemed awkward to me, not only because of his questions, but also because I was several inches taller than him, so he had to look up the entire time. This was not new to me. I grew up very quickly, and by the time I was a sophomore in high school, I was just under 6 feet tall. I turned out to be not only the tallest girl in the class, but also taller than most of the boys. It's no wonder I didn't have a rich social life. What boy wants to date a girl who's taller than him? So I'm used to guys looking up to me when they talk to me. Only this man did not look up, he continued to look at my badge. Or perhaps he was staring at my breasts, but given their modest size, that was unlikely. Well, actually, since I stopped running on the university team, it has increased a little. I was on the track team in high school and my first 2 years of university. Due to my rapid growth and constant training, my breasts were barely noticeable. But after I sprained my knee and stopped doing cross-country my sophomore year at Tyler, my breasts got a little bigger. However, no one would mistake me for Kim Kardashian, so I figured Mr. HR was just trying to figure out how to pronounce my name. Luckily, I spotted Mr. Jorgenson nearby and used him as an excuse to end the conversation. "Oh, there's my boss," I said and started waving my hand. "Mr. Jorgenson, hello, this is Ann Ox." As I got closer, I saw that he was accompanied by a rather elegantly dressed woman who looked several years older than Mr. Jorgenson. As I got closer, Mr. Jorgenson said, "Hello, Miss Ox, glad you could come. I'd like to introduce you to my wife, Edith." Turning to the woman, he said, "Edith, this is Ann Ox, the newest member of my audit team." Mrs. Jorgenson looked me up and down for a few seconds. I felt like I was under a microscope. Probably because of my height, I thought. Then I heard her mutter about what I expected. After a moment, she looked up and asked, "Where are you from, Miss Ox?" I'm from Tyler, Texas, ma'am." "Tyler? Well, no doubt you are glad to leave this dusty little town." Before I could respond, she turned to her husband. "Come on, Kurt, I want to talk to your vice president before he opens another can of Lone Star beer. All the best, Miss Ox." With these words, she turned and walked on. Mr. Jorgenson gave me a small smile and said, "Have a good time." He then followed his wife down the path. Remaining in place, I thought, what was that? Insulting someone else's hometown seemed rude to me, but maybe people express themselves differently in Houston. And what did she mean when she said that I was exactly what she expected me to be? Did I do something wrong? While I was thinking about what had happened, I was almost knocked over by Jerry Higgins as I ran. I stumbled, and he grabbed me by the arm and abruptly pulled me to my feet. He smelled like beer. "Hey, Annie," he said too loudly. "I just wanted to find you. Let me show you the park. It's full of cool rides, and you also have to see the arcade. And yes, we definitely need to get you a beer." Before I could come to my senses and start protesting, he was already dragging me towards the beer tent. Luckily, when I looked in that direction, I saw Buffalo Bill walking towards us with 2 cans of beer in his hands. "Buffalo Bill," I screamed almost desperately, "over here." "Annie Oakley, Jerry," he responded. "Hey, I was just hoping to meet you too." When Bill approached us, Jerry released my hand with displeasure. "Well, you two move on, and I'll go get myself another beer," he muttered, throwing a gloomy look at me over his shoulder and leaving. "What was that?" asked Bill. And then, seeing the expression on my face, he added worriedly, "Are you okay?" "I think so now," I replied, but it was a little over the top. At Bill's urging, I told him about my conversation with Jerry at lunch and about today's situation. "I don't want to hurt Jerry, but I just don't know what to do with him," I admitted. Bill looked at me with his usual sly smile. "Don't worry so much, Annie Oakley. Jerry is a good guy, but he doesn't know how to approach girls. And when he drinks, his lack of social skills becomes even more obvious. Don't worry. On Monday, he'll show up with a hangover and apologize, you'll see." It was hard for me to believe it, but Bill took my arm and led me in the other direction. "Come on," he said. "I want to introduce you to Denise." As we walked along the path, he apparently noticed that I was still worried about the run-in with Jerry. "Well, come on, don't think about it. Besides, guys probably fall for you all the time." "What? No," I answered in surprise. "Why would guys look at me?" He looked at me with some strange expression, but did not have time to say anything, as he noticed his wife. "Here she is," he said. I looked in that direction and saw a woman resembling the one in the photo of Buffalo Bill on his desk. She was wearing designer jeans that hugged her legs and a white tank top that showed off her figure. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, which she pulled through a hole in her baseball cap. To complete her look, she wore oversized aviator sunglasses. Her outfit reminded me of a movie star trying to remain incognito. I could never look like that. I was all angular elbows and knees. As we got closer, I noticed that she was deep in conversation with someone she knew. "Isn't that Mr. Jorgenson?" I was surprised. Bill shook his head with a wry smile. Yes, this is Denise. She always tries to make connections to help me climb the career ladder. She has big ambitions. As we got even closer, Mr. Jorgenson apparently noticed us because he stepped away from Denise and turned to leave. "Excuse me," he said, "I need to catch up with Edith." With these words, he quickly left. "What was that?" Bill asked his wife. "It never hurts to say something nice to your boss," she replied indifferently. Then, before Bill could add anything, she turned to me and looked me up and down just like Mrs. Jorgenson did. "So, who's your friend?" she asked. "This is Ann Ox," Bill replied. "She's a new member of our team that I told you about." "Oh yes," Denise said, taking off her glasses and looking at me again. "Your Astros jersey would look better if it weren't covered in barbecue stains." I looked down and was horrified to notice several large red stains on my t-shirt where Jerry had grabbed me. While I was trying unsuccessfully to wipe them off with a napkin, Denise turned and said, "I need to find a friend, Bill. See you at the beer tent." Turning to me, she added dryly, "Nice to meet you, Miss Ox," and left. Bill looked confused. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what came over her. She doesn't usually act like this." Then he looked at my face and noticed the tears running down my cheeks. "Don't cry," he said awkwardly. "Let me help you with your shirt." He took the napkin he was holding and tried to blot the stains on my t-shirt, but then changed his mind and just handed me the napkin. I tried in vain to erase the stains and then gave up. Instead, I turned and headed back towards the exit. "Don't go, Annie," Bill said helplessly. "It's okay," I said, sobbing. "I need to go home and wash this t-shirt before the stains are completely set in. Besides, I think I've had enough of a picnic for today." With these words, I trudged towards the exit, hunching over to hide the stains on my t-shirt and hide my tears. What a terrible day, I thought as I started the car. My Astros jersey is probably ruined. Everyone I've met has been either rude or weird or obnoxious, and I don't even know what I did wrong. Once again, I wondered if I had made a mistake by agreeing to this job. On the Monday after the Buffalo Bill picnic, I was especially invited to lunch. As soon as we placed our order, it became clear why. He wanted to apologize again for what happened at the picnic. I assured him that I had already forgotten about everything, but I soon realized that what he really wanted to talk about was his marriage. "I think Denise was rude because she was having a hard time," he explained. "At first, she didn't want to leave Dallas, but now it's hard for her to come to terms with the fact that I'm on the road so often. We discussed this before I took the job, and I warned her that she would have to travel a lot." He took a big bite of the sandwich. "But then she was delighted that I would work for a large corporation and receive a higher salary than I could find elsewhere. I don't think she thought at the time that she would have to sacrifice anything." He was silent for a moment, considering his words. He continued, "But now she feels lonely and unhappy that I am often away from home. Sometimes there is tension between us, and I think that's why she was rude to you at the picnic," he said. "I'm so sorry, Bill," I responded sympathetically. "I can imagine how difficult this might be for both of you." "If we can hang on for a couple more years," he said, "I can save enough money to do what I really want to do, open my own accounting firm in Boulder." "I've never been to Colorado," I said, "but to be honest, I've never been anywhere outside of Texas. What's so special about it?" Bill looked thoughtfully to the side, as if he was mentally transported there. "This is amazing," he said almost in awe. "Boulder is located at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, where the mountains meet the prairies. There are plenty of opportunities for outdoor activities, and although the city itself is not very large, the university attracts many interesting events. I'd love to go back there someday." "Sounds great," I replied sincerely. "How does Denise feel about this idea?" His face lost some of its enthusiasm. "She likes big cities better," he admitted. "But if she had agreed to at least try to live there, I think she would have fallen in love with this place too." Then he seemed to come back to reality and looked at me again. I didn't want to go off topic, but I still wanted to apologize for her, and let you know that she's not usually like this." I brushed it off, pretending it didn't matter, but hearing Buffalo Bill talk to me so openly lifted my spirits a little after a terrible weekend. It seemed to me that he was beginning to become a friend to me, and I really needed this. What they don't warn you about in audit training is how lonely the job can be, especially if you're a field auditor. Over the next 2 months, I probably spent 4 days out of every week traveling. This made it impossible to make friends or settle down somewhere. If we were on a business trip all week, we were allowed to go home for the weekend, but that was barely enough time to unpack mail, pay bills, and wash clothes. I probably threw out half the food in the refrigerator before I realized that it's better to buy very little food and eat out more often when I'm at home. In addition, there was an unwritten rule not to develop close relationships with local employees on sites because we had to check their work. Usually, we were given a separate room for the audit and met with locals only at official meetings. As a result, they usually treated us with distrust and sometimes outright hostility. All in all, it was a pretty lonely life, and it's no wonder that the turnover rate was so high, despite the good pay. The only salvation was my team. Buffalo Bill turned out to be a pleasant conversationalist, and we became good friends. He always managed to cheer me up when work became too stressful. I found that I could open up to him, tell him about my experiences, and he listened carefully, always offering words of encouragement. Probably, if it weren't for him, I would have returned home to Tyler. Even Jerry wasn't so bad. On Monday after the picnic, he apologized for his behavior, although I told him that I had long forgotten about it. I think he was still interested in me because sometimes I would catch him looking at me, but I just ignored it and nothing else happened. In addition, Jerry turned out to be a real master at working with the COG automated accounting system. When problems arose with a program, he knew almost intuitively where to look for the error. Several situations like this made Bill, and I truly appreciate his presence on the team. Only Mr. Jorgenson remained. He continued to remain a mystery to us. As a senior director, he interacted with local management, meeting with them to discuss the scope of our work, resolving any issues that arose and summarizing the results at the end of the audit. His management style seemed strange and distant to me. After the first meeting with the local leadership, he gathered us and gave us assignments, as well as any special questions or concerns. After that, we hardly saw him during the day. However, several times during each assignment, he called one of us to his room in the evening to conduct an audit of our work. Sometimes he used these meetings to explain to us special situations that we might encounter while working with a particular unit. Other times he would simply check our reports, pointing out any shortcomings. It was like a university course taught by a particularly demanding professor. Buffalo Bill, Jerry, and I often discussed it, trying to understand it. Although he rarely appeared in public, he always knew what we were doing. He never praised us for doing a good job. He simply expected us to live up to his high standards. In truth, even though he rarely raised his voice, he instilled fear in us. We respected him, but at the same time we were afraid. The first time he called me to his room for an evening check, I was scared. When I knocked on the door at the appointed time, he invited me in. I walked over to the couch where he was sitting and stood in front of him, waiting while he looked at something on the laptop on the coffee table. I stood there for several long minutes, trying not to shake, while he looked at the screen. Finally, he looked up at me, expressing no emotion. "The quality of your work is satisfactory, Miss Ox. The pace of completion of tasks is a little slower than expected, but I attribute this to your newness in the business. However, I expect you to speed up in the future. Your interaction with the local accounting team has been positive, and you make a good impression. That's all for today, Miss Ox. I will contact you for the next check in a few days." With these words, he returned to his laptop, and I realized that they had let me go. As I walked back down the corridor, I felt inspired. I expected a stern reprimand, but instead my work satisfied him. And then it dawned on me. He even complimented me on my appearance. Walking past the mirror in the hallway, I noticed that my face was glowing with joy. Of course, that didn't stop him from scolding me the next time for not maintaining graphing standards in my last presentation. After that test, I returned to the room, upset by his criticism, but determined to win his approval. I desperately wanted to prove that I could live up to his standards. It was interesting to see how my colleagues reacted to Mr. Jorgenson. Jerry hated him because he was openly afraid of our boss. Jerry may have been very smart about systems, but time after time Mr. Jorgenson caught him making mistakes when the system couldn't handle all the exceptions that came up. When this happened, Mr. Jorgenson harshly criticized Jerry for the shortcomings of the system, and he became very angry. He believed that it was not his fault and lived in constant fear of the next test, where he could be caught making a new mistake. Buffalo Bill treated everything like a game. He kept score for each of us and gave out comic prizes for the least number of punctures during the audit. I think Mr. Jorgenson guessed his mood, but Bill never allowed himself to be disrespected, and he made very few mistakes, so Mr. Jorgenson had no reason to rebuke him. Plus, Bill's humor and easygoing approach to situations helped keep us all sane. Even Jerry couldn't stay mad for long when Buffalo Bill began to imitate Mr. Jorgenson, complete with Nazi salutes and goose walks. But everything changed during our trip to West Virginia. COG's shale operations were headquartered in Charleston, and although the office itself was small, shale oil production grew rapidly. Accordingly, management at headquarters wanted to keep a close eye on what was happening there. I've never been to West Virginia before, and to be honest, I've never left Texas. Because it is a mountainous area, I thought it would be cool, but Buffalo Bill warned me that summers in West Virginia could get hot and muggy. I checked the weather forecast and decided to leave my usual pantsuits at home and take light summer dresses with me. These dresses were long enough to hide my awkward legs, and I really appreciated Bill's warning because the temperature on the day we arrived at Yeager Airport was 34 degrees Celsius. Mr. Jorgenson flew in a day ahead of us, and when we arrived at the COG office, he immediately gathered us to give us instructions. Previously, I worked exclusively with accounts receivable and payable, so I was shocked when he assigned me to review asset valuations. He must have noticed the confusion on my face because he addressed me directly. Miss Ox, it's time to step out of your comfort zone. You can't just deal with accounts payable and receivable all the time. You should be ready for new challenges. Didn't you study asset valuation standards in orientation? Will this be a problem? Yes, sir. I mean, no, sir, I began to stutter. So, yes, sir, I have looked into asset valuation, and no, sir, this will not be a problem. Very good, he answered coldly. I'm waiting for the results to be checked tomorrow evening. He then proceeded to hand out assignments to Jerry and Buffalo Bill and then released us. As we walked back to the hotel, Buffalo Bill turned to me. I don't understand why Jorgenson took on you. I don't remember him changing tasks like that before. Maybe he didn't like how I handled the last task, I suggested pessimistically. No, that's not true, Bill said. I checked your work, and it was perfect. Did you check my work? I asked in surprise. Of course, Annie Oakley, I was just keeping an eye on you, he replied with a wink. Then his tone became more serious. Just follow the procedures and double-check your calculations. Everything will be fine. I nodded, determined to earn Mr. Jorgenson's respect no matter how difficult he made my life. As for Bill checking my work, I couldn't decide whether to be angry at him for spying or grateful for his concern. By the end of the next day, I came to the conclusion that I was worrying in vain. Everything was in place, and I easily remembered the procedure for assessing rental rights from our introductory course. So when I knocked on Mr. Jorgenson's door that evening to check in, I felt quite confident. He didn't speak right away when I entered. Instead, he continued to stare at his laptop screen. Finally, he looked up and stared at me as if studying me under a microscope. Miss Ox, are you completely incompetent? I recoiled as if he had slapped me in the face. He didn't stop. Your work on the assessment of shale oil rights was completely wrong. You have not followed our corporate accounting standards, and all your work in a day is a waste of my time. What can you say in your defense? It became difficult for me to breathe. This can't be true, I thought. Sir, there must have been a mistake. I'm sure I did the calculations correctly, I said, clutching at straws. Oh, really? He said sarcastically. Well, look for yourself. With that, he handed me his laptop, and I saw that it was open on COG Online Accounting Standards. There, in plain sight, were the procedures for assessing oil and gas rights, which were very different from how I followed them. At that moment, all the old fears and complexes that I had fought so hard for years came flooding back with renewed vigor. How could I be so stupid? How could I let Mr. Jorgenson down? My throat tightened and tears streamed down my cheeks. I could only look at the floor, stunned, unable to understand what had happened. You understand that I am obliged to report the shortcomings in your assessment, he said coldly. This will certainly affect your evaluation and your future in the company. Oh no, I thought. I'm going to be fired. How can I explain to my parents that I wasn't good enough, that I failed? Isn't there anything I can do, Mr. Jorgenson? I begged. I can recalculate all the values. I'll fix everything by morning. That won't be enough, he replied coldly. Even if you correct your mistakes, I will need a good reason to be sure that you will not be so careless in the future. You will have to accept some kind of punishment to demonstrate your commitment. I'll do anything, Mr. Jorgenson, I sobbed. Please give me one more chance. I'll prove that I'm worth it. He looked me over and his breathing became a little more rapid. He pushed the laptop aside and motioned for me to come over. Well, Miss Ox, if you are willing to accept your punishment, perhaps I can turn a blind eye to your transgression, he said, beckoning me to come over. What is he saying? I asked myself. What does he mean? But I still hesitantly moved towards him until I finally found myself right in front of him. I looked at him with concern. Get on your knees, he said. I must have hesitated because he barked, Get on your knees. His voice did not allow for delay. I knelt down in front of him, overcome with fear of what might happen next. Girls who don't follow directions should be punished for their misdeeds, so they don't forget about it next time. My mind was racing like a fly in a jar. I felt outraged and helpless, intimidated and humiliated. This can't be real, I screamed to myself. This must be a nightmare. But I still obeyed his order, although another part of me screamed, Run! Very good, Miss Ox. You can go now. I'll be expecting revised asset valuations in the morning. Somehow I managed to get back to my room. Once I closed and locked the door, I shed my clothes as quickly as possible and climbed into the shower, desperately trying to erase any trace of what had just happened. While the water was pouring on me, I tried to understand what had happened. He used you, a voice screamed in my head. He used his position and his authority to force you to have unwanted sex with him. It's your own fault for being so careless and failing your task, retorted another voice. You got what you deserved. He not only used you, he beat you, objected to the first voice. Yes, and you enjoyed every minute, you little prostitute, came the answer. I ran my head under the shower, trying to clear my thoughts, but it didn't help. Finally, I turned off the water. I still didn't understand why I allowed Mr. Jorgenson to treat me like that. The fact that I didn't resist only made my shame worse. This whole episode seemed like a nightmare. Finally, in desperation, I carefully sat down in front of my laptop, opened the online standards, and began to rework the report, which was so messed up. Getting lost in numbers and formulas was the only way to escape from the hustle and bustle. I don't know what I looked like the next morning, but when Buffalo Bill saw me, there was a look of concern on his face. Is everything okay, Annie? He asked excitedly. It's okay, I lied. It was just hard to sleep last night. Bill left it without comment, but I noticed that he kept glancing at me throughout the morning. When Mr. Jorgenson walked into the room, I thought I was about to faint, but he barely glanced in my direction and didn't mention anything that had happened the night before. By the time he finished his speech, I had come to my senses a little. But when he was leaving, he looked at me and said, Miss Ox, I'll meet you in my room after dinner. I must have turned pale because Bill looked at me with concern again. But before he could say anything, Jerry started teasing me. Annie Oakley is in trouble, he sang in a childish manner. She will receive punishment. I sank into a chair, and Bill turned to Jerry with fury. Shut up, Jerry. You don't understand anything. He snapped, and Jerry returned to his computer with a dissatisfied look. Bill came up to me. Are you sick, Annie Oakley? You're so pale, like a ghost. No, everything is fine, I answered in despair, trying to find an excuse. It just seems that women's days will begin soon. Bill blushed with embarrassment. Oh, sorry, Annie. I didn't want to get into your business. It's okay, Bill, I interrupted him. I just need to go to the ladies' room, and hurriedly left the room. Once in the toilet, I splashed cold water on my face, which helped a little. Somehow I managed to hold out until lunch, although I barely touched my food. Later, the guys invited me to dinner at a restaurant they found in Huntington, but I declined, saying I would order room service. But I didn't actually order, I just didn't have the appetite, knowing that I'd soon have to go back to Mr. Jorgenson's room. By the time I had to go, I could barely pull myself together. I decided to wear the only pantsuit I'd brought with me, hoping it would provide some protection from whatever he had in mind. Then I walked down the corridor to his room, feeling like a condemned man walking his last mile. When I walked into Mr. Jorgenson's room, he was sitting on the couch with his computer on his lap. I checked the asset data you recalculated. I'm pleased that everything appears to be in order and done to COG standards, he said. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe things won't be so bad. But his next words crushed my hopes. However, the mistake you made yesterday was very serious, and it should not happen again. It's my responsibility to make sure you don't forget this. Come here, Miss Ox. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I reluctantly approached him. Please don't, Mr. Jorgenson. Please don't punish me again. Get on your knees, was his only answer. I started to sob, but obeyed. Never in my life have I felt so humiliated. He looked at me without any sympathy, and then said sharply, Go wash yourself. We don't want anyone to see you like this. When I got to his bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror. This must be what a woman of easy virtue looks like, I thought bitterly. When I washed my face and returned, he had already buttoned up his pants and was working at the computer again. Good night, Miss Ox, he said, and I realized that I could leave. Somehow I made it to my room. I immediately vomited into the sink. After I cleaned the sink and tidied myself up, I undressed and went to bed. I have never felt so low in my life. Part of me wanted to go back to my parents' home and forget about everything, but the thought of having to tell them what happened filled me with horror. They warned me, and I didn't listen to them. If I returned home, I would have to face not only their disappointment, but also the fact that they were right. Eventually, I cried and fell asleep. When the wake-up call came, I somehow managed to get out of bed and clean myself up. The only thing that kept me going was the thought that we were scheduled to depart today for our next mission. I definitely didn't want to stay in Charleston. As normal procedure, Mr. Jorgenson would have held a final meeting with us on the completed audit and provided guidance for the next assignment. The thought of seeing him again made me panic, but as the morning wore on, he still didn't show up. Instead, Bill received a phone call, and after the conversation told us that Mr. Jorgenson had returned to Houston ahead of schedule. What was even stranger was that Bill said that Jorgenson would not be accompanying us on our next audit assignment. The three of us were to fly to Oklahoma City and conduct a quick audit of the COG office there. Why the hell are we going to Oklahoma again? Jerry grumbled. We were there quite recently. I have no idea, Bill answered, but the boss said, so we're going. The fact is that Bill and Jerry were already in our office in Oklahoma this year. Moreover, the COG operation there was small, and the latest audit did not reveal any irregularities. Neither of us could understand why another visit was necessary, but I was so glad that I wouldn't have to see Mr. Jorgenson again that I didn't care. On the long flight that day, I sat next to Buffalo Bill, and he gave me several worried glances. Several times I was almost ready to tell him what happened, but I was so ashamed and so scared that I could not bring myself to open my mouth, although keeping this secret seemed like torture to me. Besides, I thought, Bill has Denise to think about. The last thing he needs is my problems. I felt terribly alone. We arrived in Oklahoma City late in the evening. Jerry and I checked into the hotel, and Bill, as team leader, went to the COG office to meet with the local CFO. Over dinner that evening, he told us about the first meeting. "These guys think we're crazy," he said bluntly. "The CFO told me that nothing had changed in recent months, and that it was a waste of both their time and ours. Honestly, the more I hear about the situation, the more convinced I am that he is right." We continued to discuss this over dinner. It was too late to do anything that night, but we agreed that Bill would contact Jorgenson the next morning to let him know about the situation and see if there were any problems that we weren't aware of. When we got to the COG offices the next day, Bill called Mr. Jorgenson. When he hung up, his face was one of complete bewilderment. His secretary said he took the day off. He said, "What should we do now?" Jerry and I were equally puzzled. The only thing we could think of was to follow normal protocols and start an on-site audit. But even that plan didn't work when the accounting system suddenly crashed later that morning. We had no choice but to sit and wait for the IT service to figure out what happened and restore the system. An hour later, we received an update. The motherboard of the server on which the accounting system was located had failed. We were told it would take 2 days to get a replacement delivered and restart the system. "That's it," Bill said. "Let's go to the airport and see if we can catch the flight home. If they still want this stupid audit, we'll be back on Monday." We made it to the airport just in time to catch a direct Southwest flight to Houston. As a result, we landed in the early afternoon. Jerry immediately rushed to his car and drove home, but before he left, Bill grabbed my hand. "Listen, I need to talk to you." I tried to dodge, but Bill insisted, and I simply didn't have the strength to resist. Bill found an unused waiting room and took me there. "Okay, Annie, what's going on?" he demanded. "You've looked like death for the last 2 days." "What's happened?" "Nothing," I said. "It doesn't matter." He took my hands and looked straight into my eyes. "I think I know you well enough to know that something happened to you. I'm your friend, Annie Oakley. Please let me help you." I looked at him for a moment, and suddenly all my resolve collapsed, and I burst into tears. Bill put his arm around me to comfort me and held me until I regained some control. Then he looked at me again with a serious face and said, "What's happened? You can tell me everything." And I told you. Everything burst out of me like pus from an open abscess, with the most disgusting and humiliating details. Once I started talking, it was impossible to stop. As I spoke, Bill's expression changed from disbelief to shock to anger. "That bastard," he exclaimed when I finished my story. "He did it against your will." "No," I cried. "I mean, if my body responded, how could it be?" "It doesn't matter," he said angrily. "He forced you to have sex against your will. He used his power to force you to do something you didn't want to do. He beat you, for God's sake." I couldn't look him in the eyes, remembering the punishment Mr. Jorgenson gave me. "But it was my fault, Bill. If I hadn't made mistakes in asset valuations, this would never have happened," I said. "First of all, even if you made a mistake, it's not such a big problem. We've all made mistakes at some point. Besides, you fixed them overnight, didn't you?" he insisted. "Yes, but he was the one who discovered my mistake. I let him down, I let the team down. I screwed up and deserved to be punished." "This is crazy," Bill said sharply. "At worst, you deserve a reprimand, but not sexual violence." Then his eyes narrowed. "You weren't flirting with him, were you? You didn't do anything to make him think you were sexually interested in him, right?" "Of course not," I said indignantly. Then I thought for a moment. I was wearing a skirt, not trousers. Maybe he understood this as a signal. And besides, I would have thought that my skinny legs would repel him rather than attract him. Bill looked at me carefully. "Why do you always humiliate yourself, Annie? You have no idea what you really look like." But then his expression changed again, and the rage appeared on his face again. "But what you wore doesn't matter. You could be in a bikini, and that still wouldn't give him the right to touch you, let alone have sex with you against your will. We sat in silence for several minutes, but suddenly it dawned on me and tears began to stream down my face again. Bill tried so thoughtfully to support me, but now I regretted ever telling him. He was the only one whose opinion mattered to me, and now he knew how stupid I was. To make matters worse, now he knew that I was a woman of easy virtue. Why did I even tell him all this? Suddenly, I couldn't stand being around Bill anymore, knowing what he must be thinking about me. I jumped to my feet and ran across the terminal. Bill was so stunned that it gave me a head start, and I ran away before he could catch up with me. Apparently, I haven't lost all my cross-running skills. Now I knew exactly what I had to do. I called Mr. Jorgenson's office, and when his secretary answered, I asked for the address of his home. I have very important documents that he is expecting today, I lied, and without hesitation, she gave me his home address. While I was driving, I thought about my plan. The idea was simple. I was going to meet him face to face and demand that I be transferred to another audit group. It wasn't the best plan. I had no idea what I'd do if he said no, but it was the only way I could have any control over my life. And, whispered an inner voice, this is the only way to escape from people who now know what you really are. When I drove up to his house, my hands were shaking with fear, but I forced myself to get out of the car, go to his porch, and ring the doorbell. I waited, but no one opened. A wave of relief washed over me. He probably wasn't at home. But I strictly told myself that I had to make sure. I walked around one side of the house and heard a noise coming from the wall that surrounded the backyard. There was a gate, and I opened it slightly to look inside, but immediately recoiled in embarrassment. Oh my, the sounds I heard came from a couple making love on a lounge chair by the pool, 10 feet from the gate. I immediately recognized Mr. Jorgenson's dark hair and quickly pulled my head away so as not to be noticed. No wonder he didn't hear the call. They made so much noise that they wouldn't even notice the army. But then an instant memory of that scene seemed to flash before me, and I froze. The woman was not Mrs. Jorgenson, that was for sure. She was too young. But she seemed familiar to me. I looked through the gate again. Now there was no doubt. It was Denise, Buffalo Bill's wife. I stood there, stunned, when I heard a car pull up ahead. I quickly ran around the other side of the house, hoping to get to the car and leave before I was caught trespassing. But to my horror, Bill himself got out of the car and walked towards me. Confusion paralyzed me, which gave Bill enough time to catch up with me. Jorgenson's secretary told me you were coming here, he said. You didn't do anything stupid, I hope. Bill, please, we need to leave, I said desperately, grabbing his hand and trying to lead him back to the car. But he didn't move. What's going on here? He demanded. What did you do? And suddenly there was a loud sound from behind the wall, and Bill's head shot up. It was Denise's cry. He screamed. Bill rushed to the gate I had just left, opened it, and froze in amazement. With a growl, Bill burst into the yard. Jorgenson's eyes widened at the noise, and, seeing an angry Bill standing in front of him, he jumped to his feet. That's my wife, you bastard, Bill roared and punched Jorgenson. Bill's face burned with rage. He turned to Denise, who had already climbed out of the pool. What the hell are you doing? He shouted. To my surprise, Denise answered calmly and reservedly. I'm sorry you had to find out everything like that, Bill, but it doesn't change anything. I'm leaving you for Kurt. He and I will get married as soon as our divorces are finalized. It was as if Bill had been punched in the stomach. Are you leaving me for Kurt Jorgenson? He asked incredulously. Yes, Bill, I'm going to Kurt, she said, as if explaining something to a child. He loves me, and I fell in love with him. Besides, he has more ambition than you will ever have, and he can provide for me much better than you can. Oh, so that's how it is, Bill said loudly. Well, if he loves you so much, then why did he have sex with Annie Ox this week? Ooh, I screamed as if I had been stabbed. How could he say that? Annie, I'm sorry, Bill tried to apologize. That's not how I meant it. He wanted to console me, but Denise was faster. You bitch. she screamed, rushing towards me with outstretched arms like claws. "Stay away from Kurt, he's mine." Bill quickly grabbed her before she could reach me, and I froze in place, still in shock. While Bill was holding Denise, I noticed movement in the house. Kurt Jorgenson emerged wearing a robe, followed by Houston police. "I want him arrested for trespassing and assault," he shouted, pointing at Bill. Two police officers quickly moved towards Bill to take him into custody. After the police questioned everyone, I was released and Bill was taken away in handcuffs. Denise and Kurt came to the door to watch me drive away. I thought Jorgenson was laughing as I pulled out of the driveway. That night, I was in a daze. My mind was so overloaded that it could no longer function except to carry out the most normal activities. In the end, I fell into bed and slept like the dead. The next morning, the same automatic feeling helped me get dressed and drive to the office. Bill wasn't there, but Jerry was there. When he saw me, an evil grin appeared on his face. Well, if it's not Miss Exemplary, I wasn't the right person for you to go on a date with, but you slept with Kurt Jorgenson without any problems." I cringed. If Jerry knew what happened, then the whole company knew. And of course, within 15 minutes, I received a call from the HR department and asked me to come to them immediately. I knew almost immediately what this meant, and I was right. That afternoon, I found myself on the highway, driving home to Tyler, jobless, disgraced, and humiliated. The only thing I was missing was a scarlet letter A on my chest to wear in front of my parents. I was so grateful when my adoptive parents took me in all those years ago. I was 13 and had lived in an orphanage since I was 6 years old. My father left when I was very young. I have only vague memories of him. When my mother died in a car accident, she had no other living relatives. The authorities tried to find my father, but he was never found, so I had no choice but to end up in an orphanage. I had almost given up hope that I would ever find a family that would accept me when the Sykes couple showed up. They had already fostered several foster children and agreed to take me in when they learned my story. I can't say I ever loved them the way you love your real parents, but they were kind to me and tried to raise me right. What they lacked in intimacy and affection, they more than made up for in care and attention. If they were strict and demanding, I knew it was because they cared about my safety and development. If you've ever lived in a shelter, you know that feeling safe is very expensive, and I have always been grateful for everything they did for me. So you can imagine how painful it was to admit to them what happened. I felt I had to be honest and admit everything. My big mistake, my failure to resist Mr. Jorgenson, my dismissal from Consolidated. When I finished, my parents didn't say much, but I could tell by their faces how disappointed they were with me. What made it worse was that they were initially against my moving to Houston. Dad wanted me to stay and do accounting on their pink farm, but I was so eager to try myself in a big city and in a big corporation. Now I had to admit that they were right all along. So I returned to work at their nursery. The first thing you should know about commercial rose farming is that it's no different from any other farming. You're at the mercy of weather, insects, disease, fluctuations in supply and demand, and all the other factors that make farming so difficult. You may think that accounting for a pink farm is easy, but it is not. Mom and Dad grew roses in 6 different categories, and each category could include up to 50 different varieties. Lots of SKUs. In addition, their nursery sold not only to garden stores and large retail chains, but also directly to consumers. Managing orders that ranged from one plant to thousands for large retailers could be quite challenging. So I spent the next few months immersed in the details of the pink business. It didn't take long before I saw opportunities to automate their accounting, and was glad I could help them in this way. But I also soon realized that the business was not very profitable. Interest on crop loans was eating their margins to the bone, and any bad weather spell or drop in prices could almost certainly mean a loss for the season. It became clear to me that Mom and Dad would have to work for a long time before they could even think about retirement. I had the idea in my head that if I became very successful at Consolidated, I might be able to help them financially. But of course, this dream died along with many others. Working on the farm kept me busy. It may not have been particularly exciting, but at least it helped take my mind off everything that had happened at Consolidated. But there were moments, especially in the evening, when I couldn't help but replay all these events in my head. I remembered how excited I was when I started my new job. Firstly, this was the first time I was truly alone with myself. Even college didn't provide such freedom because I lived at home almost all semesters. I also had to admit that I was proud to have landed such a prestigious job at a large corporation like COG. But pride goes before the fall, and my pride took a big hit when I screwed up the lease appraisals. My punishment was being used by my boss, Kurt Jorgenson, and his actions brought back all those old, bad memories of my days at the orphanage, leaving me defenseless against him. The whole episode was so painful and humiliating that even now it brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. And then, when I finally decided to meet with Mr. Jorgenson, that terrible scene happened at his home. No wonder I was fired the next day. I was stupid for going there, stupid for even making a mistake that got me into trouble. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I was that I was stupid for deciding to go into the big world, which, in essence, did not want to see me. At least, back in Tyler, I was safe in a world that, although small, was familiar to me. This is the best place for me, I decided, although this decision forced me to say goodbye to all my dreams. But it seems the big world is not done mocking me yet. One autumn evening, as I was going through our accounts, there was a knock on the door of my small office. Before I could raise my head, I heard a familiar voice that I never thought I would hear again. "You're not that easy to find, Annie Oakley." Oh my, I raised my head sharply, and my eyes confirmed what my ears had already understood. Buffalo Bill stood in front of me with a big smile on his face. I jumped to my feet, ran up to him, and threw myself on his neck. "Buffalo Bill, what are you doing here?" I asked, still amazed, but immensely happy. "I was looking for you," he laughed, "and it wasn't easy. The only contact information I had for you was my work number and COG email, so that didn't help me. Then I remembered that you live in Tyler and that your parents are rose growers. But I hit a dead end when I realized there wasn't a single rose grower in Tyler with the last name Ox. Then I remembered that you mentioned that you were an adopted child, and I decided that perhaps you had a different last name than your parents. So I went there. I think I've been to every rose nursery in town trying to find you." At that moment, my father entered the room to see what had caused such a commotion. "Dad," I said excitedly, "this is Bill Hitchcock, one of my colleagues at Consolidated." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Sykes," Bill said, extending his hand. My father frowned and did not accept the hand. "You're not the one who—" "No, Dad," I quickly inserted. "It's not him. Bill was my best friend in Houston. He tried to help me." "Okay," said the father, finally extending his hand to shake. "Sorry to be rude, but Houston is a bad place for our Annie, and we don't have a very kind attitude towards many people from there." Then he turned to leave. "I'll leave you two to talk. But don't stay too long. Annie needs to finish processing those bills." "I'll finish, Dad," I promised. Then I turned to Bill again and led him into a small reception area outside my office. When we sat down, I resumed the conversation. "Tell me what's happening to you, Buffalo Bill," I asked. "The last time I saw you, you were being taken to prison." His face took on an ironic expression. "I spent that night in a cell, but the next day I was released. They said Jorgenson dropped the charges." "I'm sorry I wasn't there, Bill," I said. "The next morning I was called in and fired. After that, all I could think about was leaving Houston and returning home." Bill's face darkened. "It's okay, Annie. Plus, as soon as I returned to the office, they fired me too. So you're talking to an unemployed accountant who's quickly burning through his savings." I didn't even think about it. "Damn, Bill, what are you going to do?" I asked him. "Long term, I'm going to do what I've always wanted to do. Move back to Boulder and open my own accounting firm," Bill answered without hesitation. "But first, I have some unfinished business in Houston." I thought I knew what he was talking about. "Of course, Denise. What's wrong with her?" Bill rolled his eyes. Oh, Annie Oakley, that's the whole story. The day after I was released from prison, I went to see a lawyer to start my divorce. Denise was fine with this. She couldn't wait to be free of me so she could marry Kurt Jorgenson. She signed the papers as soon as they were delivered to her, the judgment was made, and now we are waiting 6 months until the divorce is finalized. I took his hand to support him. I'm sorry, Bill. Despite how it happened, I know it was painful. Thank you, Annie, he said, looking into my eyes. I've almost recovered, but it was really hard. I really thought Denise was the one. This probably proves once again that sometimes you don't know a person as much as you thought. Then he straightened up. But that's not the whole story. It turns out that Kurt was fooling Denise all this time. He never intended to divorce his wife and marry her. Bill grinned. And that's not all. It seems Jorgenson has had similar affairs before. Remember I told you about Betty Murphy, who was on our team before you joined us. So I found out that Jorgenson did almost the same thing with her that he did with you. That's why she quit so suddenly. So it wasn't just me, I thought, and for some reason this comforted me, although I felt sorry for Betty. What about Mrs. Jorgenson? I asked. I don't understand why she tolerates this behavior. She should have known, right? This is where it gets interesting, Annie Oakley. Edith Jorgenson seems to really love this guy and is ready to turn a blind eye to his little affairs. Moreover, she even helps him hush up scandals. When Betty left, I think it was because Kurt's wife paid her. I know for a fact that Mrs. Jorgenson paid Denise to stop making a fuss. One day Denise threatened to sue Jorgenson, and the next day she left town without saying a word. This is so strange, I said. I just can't understand why Mrs. Jorgenson wants to stay with him after all this. Besides, if he's so into other women, why doesn't he just leave her? Bill shook his head. Why she puts up with this bastard, I have no idea. But I'm pretty sure I know why he won't leave her. It turns out that she is the daughter of the former COG president. Not only does all the money in the family belong to her, but she also has many connections in the company through her father. She's not just his feeder, she's the reason he hasn't been fired yet. Denise was a fool if she thought he would ever leave her. I shook my head in disbelief. I knew that I would never be able to understand people and their actions. It's better to deal with roses, they are much more predictable. And then I remembered something Bill said a minute ago. If you've settled things with Denise and are no longer with COG, why are you still in Houston? This time his smile was mocking. This is my unfinished business, Annie Oakley. I am suing Jorgenson for ruining my marriage and COG for helping him do it. You do realize that many times when we were away doing our checks, if he wasn't harassing women like you and Betty, Jorgenson would fly home to meet with Denise. The COG knew about his behavior and turned a blind eye to it. To me, they are just as guilty as he is. But I thought you and Denise had finished a long time ago, I said in surprise. I thought you were glad you got rid of her. It is, he answered with conviction, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let Kurt Jorgenson interfere in my life and get away with it. And I certainly won't let Consolidated Oil defend him and get away with it. I shook my head. I understand why you feel this way, Buffalo Bill, but how do you expect to take on such a large corporation and win? I know, Annie, the chances are slim, but I just can't stand by and let all this happen to me without doing anything. Anyway, I found a smart lawyer in Houston who has made a career out of throwing a spanner in the works of COG. She's beaten them before and agreed to take my case on a fee-by-result basis, so I think I have a fighting chance. He paused for a moment and looked at me. And one more thing, Annie. I may have a secret weapon. What are you talking about? He looked at me hopefully. It's you, Annie. If you come back to Houston and testify about what Jorgenson did to you, we can prove that he is a predator, that he did this more than once, and that the COG covered up his actions to protect him. I couldn't help but shudder at the thought of meeting Mr. Jorgenson again. Oh, Bill, please don't ask me to do this. I want to help, but I don't think I can meet this person again. In recent months, I have been trying to forget all this. Bringing it all back to the surface is too much. I could see he was disappointed, but I also saw the worry on his face. He leaned down and took my hands in his. "It's okay, Annie Oakley, I understand. I remember how traumatized you were when all this happened. I guess I was just hoping that time and distance had helped you heal your wounds. The last thing I want is to cause you more suffering." "What about Betty Murphy?" I asked. "Won't she be able to help prove your case?" Bill sighed heavily. "She doesn't want to testify either. She feels the same way about Jorgenson as you do. I found her, and she said she has been going to therapy since she left COG. She just can't go through this again." He looked at me carefully and seemed to make a decision. "Forget about the testimony, Annie. I should have realized it wasn't fair to ask you to go through this again." He grabbed my face by the chin, lifting it up so I was looking at him. "But anyway, I hate to see you hiding here on your parents' farm. You have so much potential, but you don't realize it. You are a smart, talented, beautiful woman, but you can't see it because of how hard life has been for you. It doesn't have to last like this, trust me." He let go of my chin and lowered his hands. Now he looked awkward, even a little embarrassed. "Before I go, there's one more thing I'd like to tell you, Annie." He fell silent, as if gathering his courage. "I didn't come just to ask you to testify. I wanted to say that I miss you and would like to see you more often." He blushed, lowered his eyes, and headed towards the door. There he stopped and turned around. "If you change your mind, call me, or if you just want to talk, or maybe come visit, or—" He paused uncertainty, then suddenly rushed back to me and, before I had time to understand anything, quickly kissed me. Then he turned sharply and walked out the door. This time he stopped and turned around again, but now he had his usual wide smile on his face. "I hope to see you soon, Annie Oakley, sure as a shot." With these words, he left. I finished working with the invoices in a kind of fog. "I like Buffalo Bill," I thought with surprise. He said I was beautiful. I always thought Bill was handsome, but when I was in Houston, he was married, so he became a good friend of mine, and I thought that was how he felt about me. But now, I took the invoice report to my father. He took it and looked at me. "Has this guy left?" he asked. I nodded. "Okay," he said. "It's better to leave all this behind." "I think I'll take a walk, Dad," I told him. I headed towards the fields. The light began to fade, but I could still see clearly. I loved walking through beautiful fields when I needed to think about something. Maybe Dad is right, I thought. The idea of returning to Houston was scary. I felt so out of place there. The prospect of meeting Mr. Jorgenson again was almost unbearable. The truth was that I always felt out of place, never comfortable where I was. Moving from my mother's house to the orphanage and then to the Rose Farm left this mark on me. Moreover, I never felt comfortable with myself. Growing up without parents was hard. Growing tall with long, skinny legs and arms made me the target of constant ridicule from other children. Even discovering my talent for math made me feel different. By the time the Sykes became my foster parents, I had already learned to be as inconspicuous as possible. Not drawing attention to myself was the best way I knew to get along with the world. But I remembered Bill didn't think I was that clumsy and awkward. He called me beautiful. Is it really true? Maybe I've changed over the years and just didn't notice it. Or was he just being kind to the poor little country girl, especially because he wanted me to do something for him? How can you even find out? While walking, I noticed a bunch of old rose bushes thrown to one side. These were returns, roses that customers did not like for some reason. We couldn't do anything with them when we returned them, so they were thrown away. Later, they were burned. I looked at the unwanted bushes lying on the ground with bare branches sticking out in all directions, and they reminded me of myself. The unwanted roses are back here. No one wanted them, and they had nowhere to go, just like me, I thought. Tears rolled down my cheeks, and I wiped them away furiously. Then something caught my eye, a small piece of color among the brown-green withering plants. I came closer and was amazed to see a yellow rose. Despite being unwanted, abandoned, and left to die, one of the rejected roses was somehow able to bloom. I stood there for a long time, looking at her and thinking. Finally, I straightened up and returned to the house. My mother was in the kitchen cooking. "Mom," I said, "I'm going back to Houston." I thought she would be shocked, but she just looked at me, tilted her head slightly to the side, and said quietly, "Are you sure, honey?" "Yes, Mom, I have to try again. Can you explain this to Dad?" She nodded, and I rushed over to her and hugged her tightly. "Thank you, Mom. Thanks for everything." Then I went to my room and started packing my things. Buffalo Bill left me his phone number, and I called him the next morning when I was on the highway heading south. He was surprised when I told him I was going, but it seemed to me that it was a pleasant surprise. "What made you change your mind?" he asked. "It's quite a long story," I replied, "but let's just say that I'm not going to let myself get thrown out without a fight." We met in the Hart's Chicken parking lot, and I surprised him by greeting him with a big kiss. He didn't say anything when we walked inside, but he had a stupid smile on his face, so I guess he didn't mind. Over a plate of Tedge's wings, he told me the latest on the lawsuit. "There's a hearing in a couple of days, so we don't have much time," he told me. "You have an appointment with my lawyer, Randy Rubenstein, this afternoon. She's a little weird, but she's the best, believe me." When we walked into Miss Rubenstein's office, she looked as if she was as interested in me as I was in her. She was tiny and round, barely more than 5 feet tall, and wore a jacket over a flowered skirt that reached to the floor. She had gray hair, which she wore parted in the middle, and she looked to be about 50 years old. When she spoke, she had a faint Central European accent, but there was no doubt about what she said. "I want you to tell me everything that happened during the inspection when you were harassed," she said. "Don't miss anything." I liked her straightforward tone, and I boldly began to talk about what happened. But when I got to the part that happened in his room, all my emotions came back to me, and I cried so hard that I could not continue. "It's okay, honey," she said softly, handing me a box of tissues and waiting for me to compose myself. "There is a way to deal with this. You need to stop thinking about yourself. Instead, I want you to imagine that you are watching a drama on TV. Tell me what the actors are doing on screen." Strange, but it helped. When I stopped saying I and me and started saying she and he, it became less personal, and I was able to describe what happened. When I finished, she made me go through everything again, but this time I had to write the last events of the trip first and work backwards. By the time I finished, it didn't feel as overwhelming as it did at the beginning. Miss Rubenstein made a few notes in her notebook and then turned to Bill. "Bill, could you leave us for a few minutes? I want to speak to Miss Ox alone." I was surprised, and Buffalo Bill looked puzzled, but he stood up and walked out, closing the door behind him. I started to wonder what to expect. "Why do we need to talk without Bill, Miss Rubenstein?" I asked timidly. "Before we get into this, I want you to call me Randy, and I'll call you Annie," she said. "We're on the same side, and I want you to feel free with me to say whatever you want." As for why I asked Bill to leave, I did it because I want to tell you something you might not want to hear. I want you to feel free to say, "Go to hell, Randy," if you want. I laughed, but she didn't, and I wondered if maybe she really was serious. "Annie, when we get to court, Consolidated Oil's lawyer won't be nice to you. He will try to prove that everything that happened is your fault. He will try to portray you as a promiscuous young girl who wanted to sleep with the boss to get ahead in her job." As she spoke, I felt myself turning pale. "No," I objected. "This is not true. You know this, and I know this, but our task is to convince the judge," she answered calmly. "At this point, I think our chances are less than 50-50. My heart sank. She tilted her head and looked at me appraisingly. "Bill told me a little about you, and now I had the opportunity to observe you a little. Do you want to know what I learned and why I made this observation?" "I think so," I answered uncertainty. "Annie, I know something about your past and the trials you went through. With that in mind, I'm amazed at how well you did. However, the truth is that you are not a very confident woman. You don't like to be the center of attention. Even now, as we speak, I see you twisting and trying to hide in this chair." I blushed, realizing how much I was slouched. I believe that your description of what happened in Kurt Jorgenson's room was truthful and accurate, she continued. Your story was clear, but you spoke uncertainty so that your manner of presentation may raise doubts about the veracity of your words in the judge. My heart sank again. I knew she was right, we were doomed. If Randy noticed my despair, she didn't show it. Instead, she changed her tone slightly. But I also know something else about you that you may not have considered, she continued. I looked up curiously. I know, for example, that, despite all the obstacles, you were able to graduate first in your class in accounting. I started to object, but she waved her hand, stopping me. I know that you were able to get a very prestigious job at Consolidated, despite serious competition from both other graduates of the University of Texas at Tyler and from more famous universities, she continued. And most importantly, she said, I know that you refused Bill when he asked for your help in Tyler, but you still found the strength to accept the challenge. I want to know where you got these powers, Annie. I found them in a yellow rose, I answered quietly. A look of confusion flashed across her face, but she continued. Wherever you found them, you showed me that you have all the necessary resources to cope with the challenges ahead. You can overcome this too if you remember everything you have already achieved and believe in yourself. I hoped she was right. I wanted to believe, but it was so difficult. Randy wasn't finished. Now you have homework for today and tomorrow. In the folder on my desk are copies of all the documents, files, and testimony that we were able to obtain in this case. I want you to look through them tonight to refresh your memory of all the details. I want you to be as knowledgeable and prepared for this matter as if it happened yesterday. I don't want any surprises when we walk into the courtroom, and if you see anything that gives you new memories or any information that we can use, please let me know immediately. I nodded, took the folder, and stood up to leave. Wait, she commanded, there's something else. I quickly sat down. I noticed something else about you, Randy said. You use your clothes to hide from people. You try to be inconspicuous, even though you are an attractive young woman. Your appearance says that you are not confident in yourself. I want it to express your confidence. I want you to look different, to feel different on the witness stand. But all my clothes look like this, I objected. She took a business card from the table, wrote something on it, and handed it to me. My daughter is a personal stylist at Nordstrom in the gallery. Tomorrow morning, take this to her and tell her that I want you to look confident and attractive. She knows what to do. When I walked out into the waiting room, Bill was waiting impatiently. We left, and he immediately wanted to know what Randy had said. I told everything because I wanted to know his opinion. He tried to be diplomatic, but I could tell he agreed with Randy's assessment. The truth was that I agreed too. I just didn't realize it was so obvious to everyone else. But I was a little surprised by Randy's instructions about new clothes. I've never heard anything like it, Bill, have you? He admitted that he had never heard of such a thing either. But I think you should trust her, Annie Oakley. She has spent her entire career fighting large corporations, and her track record is impressive. I think she knows what she's doing. I just shook my head in amazement. It was all too much, too fast. Buffalo Bill offered to take me out to dinner, promising it would be something more interesting than Hart's chicken, but I declined. Randy gave me a ton of homework for the evening. I'll just go back to my motel room and get on with it. If I'm hungry, I'll order pizza, I told him. He nodded, but I could see that he was disappointed. When I opened the folder in my room, the contents immediately brought back a flood of memories. There was a variety of materials, from corporate brochures to accounting handbooks, from emails to policy updates. But every bite looked and felt like a place I would rather never think about again in my life. However, if there's one thing I know how to do, it's study, so I dove right into the material. It was almost 10 o'clock when something caught my attention. I checked everything again, and then took out my calendar to make sure of the date. When I realized what this meant, I couldn't help myself. That son of a bitch, I screamed. Hastily, I found Randy's contact information, which she included with the documents. I didn't want to call her home at that hour, but I was so angry that I decided to do it. "Randy," I said when she finally answered, "I think I found something important." When I explained what I saw and what it meant, I could almost hear her smirk over the phone. "Don't tell anyone about this, Annie," she warned me. "We'll just hide it in our arsenal and use it when the moment is right." I promised, and after I hung up, I started getting ready for bed. I successfully completed the first part of my task, but was not sure of success with the second. The next morning at 10 o'clock, I drove to the gallery and walked into Nordstrom. At the customer service counter, I showed them the card Randy had given me, and very soon an energetic woman approached me. I had no doubt that it was Randy's daughter. She looked exactly like her mother, only 25 years younger. "Hi," she said cheerfully. "You must be Annie Ox. I'm Mindy Cohen. My mom told me to wait for you today." As she led me, I asked, "So are you here, the Wizard of Oz, who will give me courage?" She laughed cheerfully. "No, but I'm here to make you stunningly beautiful, and that's pretty much the same thing." I noticed that we walked past the women's clothing departments. "Where are we going?" I asked Mindy, confused. "Shouldn't we pick out some clothes for me for tomorrow?" "We will do that, but first we need to prepare something," she replied with a smile, pointing towards the beauty salon. "You're not going to cut my hair, are you?" I asked anxiously. Mindy just smiled and showed me the card her mother gave me. On the back, in 2 underlined words, was written, "Full complex." She ignored my protests and gently led me into the salon. 2 hours later, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me from the mirror. Not only did I get my hair cut and shaped in a modern style, but the talented young woman patiently taught me how to apply makeup, something I had never tried before. I was in slight shock. Mindy then led me back to the clothing department. Shopping used to be simple for me. I'd go to Walmart, find what I needed, buy a large size, and leave. With Mindy, shopping became an endless torture of trying on many outfits, choosing different sizes, and making changes. By the time we finished, I was exhausted. Finally, late in the afternoon, Mindy put me in the car and drove me back to the motel. "Don't let anyone see you until the hearing," she reminded me. "You will blow them away, and it should be a surprise." When I returned to my room, I couldn't resist trying on my new clothes again. I couldn't believe it. The woman who looked at me from the mirror on the wall looked like she had just stepped out of some fashion show. The clothes hugged my body and accentuated curves I didn't even know I had. My legs and arms no longer seemed long and awkward. On the contrary, that stranger looked confident and elegant. "Damn it," I thought. "Maybe I can actually handle this." The next morning, I had to take a taxi to court because I was still putting on my makeup. It took me longer than I'm used to. When I entered the courtroom, everyone was already sitting and waiting for the judge. I took a deep breath and went into the hall. Randy was the first to notice me, and she smiled widely and gave me a thumbs up when she saw me. Then Buffalo Bill turned around. At first he glanced at me briefly, but suddenly his head jerked back, and he stared at me intently. I saw his eyes widen, and then he silently said, "Annie, is that you?" I just smiled and carefully walked in my new 4-inch stilettos to the row where the witnesses were sitting. When I got there, I sat down and pulled up my pencil skirt until it was just above my knees, then carefully smoothed down the short, fitted jacket that showed off my curves. Remembering Mindy's instructions, I sat with my shoulders back and my back straight. I may be dying of fear inside, I thought, but on the outside I won't let it show. Out of the corner of my eye, I looked at the defendant's desk. There he was, my enemy, Kurt Jorgenson. He looked at me with some uncertainty, as if he didn't quite recognize me. Okay, I thought, let him worry about me now. The morning began with Bill's testimony, and after Randy finished with him, there were many cross questions, often hostile. I became more and more nervous. After a lunch break, I was finally called to the witness stand. "You can do this, Annie," I constantly reminded myself. "You are no longer the same girl who ran away from COG many months ago." Randy quickly walked me through the terrible events that began in Charleston and ended in Houston. I kept reminding myself to sit up straight and describe what was happening as if I were watching it on TV. Finally, it was time for cross-examination. The COG attorney was dressed in a cowboy-style suit and boots that clattered loudly on the marble floor as he approached the stand. He looked at his notes for a few minutes and then suddenly asked, "On that very evening, Miss Ox, is it not true that Mr. Jorgenson discovered a serious error in the work you completed that day?" "I didn't make a mistake," I replied calmly, "but the process I used was not consistent with Consolidated's current accounting procedure for oil rights. As I said, the job was done incorrectly." I said nothing. "And Mr. Jorgenson reprimanded you for your mistake, didn't he, Miss Ox?" "Yes, sir." "How did you feel after that, Miss Ox?" "I was upset. I couldn't understand how I could make such a mistake," I admitted. "Could this negatively affect your performance evaluation?" "Yes, sir," I agreed. "And didn't you offer to find a way to make up for your mistake?" "Well, yes, but—" He interrupted me. "And didn't you offer to have sex with Mr. Jorgenson so that he would turn a blind eye to your mistake?" "No, that's not true," I screamed, but he interrupted me again. "So everything that happened between you was on your initiative and completely voluntary, wasn't it, Miss Ox?" "No, that's not true," I screamed again. He made me. Mechanically waving his hand, the lawyer turned to the judge. "That's all, Your Honor. We have no more questions." Randy quickly rose to her feet. "Your Honor, I want to ask a few more questions of my client during the re-examination." The judge motioned for her to come to the stand. "Hold on, Annie, you're doing great," Randy whispered as she approached me. Then, in a normal voice, she continued. "The incident in question appears to be related to the application of Consolidated Oil's accounting procedures in relation to the valuation of rights to oil properties." She picked up a stack of papers with the COG logo at the top. "Are these the same procedures we are talking about, Miss Ox?" I recognized them immediately. Randy gave them to the defense attorney for review. After a quick glance at the papers by Jorgenson and the defense attorney, the documents were entered into the file. Randy returned to the podium. "Miss Ox, I see a note in small print on every page. Could you tell us what this mark is and what it means?" I took the papers from her again. "This is the date of change. Whenever a procedure is changed, the date of the change is indicated to avoid confusion." "What date is indicated in the changes to these procedures?" Randy asked innocently. I read the date out loud for the courtroom. "And does this date have any significance for you, Miss Ox?" she asked. "Yes," I said forcefully. "This is the same day Mr. Jorgenson molested me." The defense lawyer immediately stood up and objected to my use of the word solicited, but the judge stopped him. "I want to hear where this leads, lawyer." Randy remained unfazed. "If there are changes in procedure, how will company employees working in the field know that they need to apply the new standards?" she asked me. I turned and glared at Kurt Jorgenson. He avoided meeting my gaze. "Our manager is obliged to notify us of any changes," I answered. "And did Mr. Jorgenson notify you of this change in procedure?" Randy asked. I stared at Jorgenson with hatred. "No, I didn't notify you. He gave me this task knowing that I would not be up to date with the latest changes. He deliberately set me up to fail and then took advantage of it," I said with firmness in my voice. By the time I made my final answer, the defense lawyer was already on his feet, objecting so loudly that the judge had to use his gavel to restore order. When everyone finally fell silent, he looked at us sternly. "I don't want to hear this kind of bickering in my courtroom anymore, okay?" Then he leaned back in his chair. "We listened to a lot of testimony today, and it's already late. We are postponing the meeting until tomorrow. The court is closed." Our small team headed to Randy's office in high spirits. "We scored some big victories today," Randy said happily. Buffalo Bill was still in amazement at how everything had gone. "How the hell did you know that COG changed their rules?" he asked her. Randy smiled. "I always thought it was strange that Jorgensen suddenly changed Annie's assignment, especially when she was so new on the job. I also wondered how Annie could make such an obvious mistake. I was sure it was a setup, but it was Annie who found the clue when she noticed the date of the revision of the procedure. Jorgenson was aware of the changes, but the online versions of the document were only updated that day while Annie was working on her assignment. The printed versions probably weren't distributed for another week. At that moment, Randy's secretary came into the office. "There's a phone call for you, Miss Rubenstein. I think your answer is the defense lawyer." Randy went into another office to answer the phone, and Bill changed the subject. "Oh my God, Annie Oakley, I couldn't believe my eyes when you walked into the courtroom." My eyes almost fell to the floor. "So do you like my new look?" I asked hopefully. "Like, yes, I'm delighted. I always thought you looked great, but today you looked like a model. What happened yesterday?" I started telling him about my day with Randy's daughter at Nordstrom, but before I could finish, Randy came back into the office looking cheerful. "I told you that we have trump cards. They want to reach an agreement. They are offering $1 million to each of you to settle the lawsuit." Bill screamed joyfully and began to dance around the room. But when Randy looked at me, I just said, "No." Bill froze and stared at me. "No? Why?" I crossed my arms and pursed my lips resolutely. $2 million each for me and Bill, $2 million for Betty Murphy, who went through the same thing as me, and $5 million for the Houston Center for Women Survivors of Violence and Sexual Assault. I looked at Randy. "And one more condition. Kurt Jorgenson will be fired. It's either all of this or we go back to court." Randy looked at me appraisingly and then smiled. Well, our yellow rose has acquired thorns. I'll be right back." Bill looked at me in surprise. "Are you sure, Annie Oakley? We won the battle today, but this does not guarantee victory in the war. It is still possible that we will leave with nothing." I looked at him seriously. "I didn't come back here to settle for half the success, Buffalo Bill. If they want to fight, I'm ready to fight." At that moment, Randy returned, and this time she was not smiling. "I didn't get the numbers you wanted." Then a smile spread across her face. "I received $5 million for 3 and $10 million for the Women's Help Center." We screamed with joy and started hugging. "Oh yes," Randy interrupted. "Kurt Jorgenson was fired this afternoon, and Consolidated Oil is turning over his file to the Dawes office. Their lawyer also said that Jorgenson's wife has finally had enough of his antics and has filed for divorce." After that, we had a real celebration. Randy ordered dinner and also opened a bottle of champagne that she had been saving for a special occasion. When the glasses were filled, I raised mine and made a toast. For Randy Rubenstein, who challenged the giant and won. We drained our glasses, then Bill refilled them and proposed a toast. "And to the new Annie Oakley, strong, brave, and beautiful." I blushed deeply, but the others didn't let me laugh it off, so we all drank again. When we were done with food and drinks, Randy kicked us out. "It's time for you two to leave. You are no longer in danger, and tomorrow I have to go to court again and deal with the settlement process." We both walked up to her, hugged this petite woman, and headed off into the night. "I'll be happy to take you back to the motel," Bill offered gallantly as we got into his car. "No," I answered quickly, and he looked at me in surprise. I looked at him hopefully. "I said I didn't come back here for half the success, Buffalo Bill. I want you to take me to your home today." He turned to me, looked intently into my eyes, and asked, "Are you sure, Annie?" When I woke up, Bill was lying on his back. My head was on his right arm, which was hugging me protectively. The sun's rays were shining through the curtains, and I could see his body. Suddenly, I realized that he was not sleeping either. I raised my head to look at him and saw his familiar smirk. "Good morning, Annie Oakley," he said mischievously. "Did you know that you snore in your sleep?" "I don't snore," I said indignantly, before realizing that he was just teasing me. I shook my head in mock indignation and laid my head back on his chest. "No," he admitted, "you don't snore, but you are really very beautiful." I doubted it. I could only imagine the state my hair and makeup were in after last night. But then I thought, if he thinks so, Who am I to argue? We lay there for a few more minutes, then he stood up, leaning his back against the head of the bed, and pulled me towards him. So, he asked, now that you're rich, do you know what you'll do with all this money? Actually, I know, at least partially. I'll give half to my foster parents in Tyler. They have been very kind to me, and this is my chance to repay them for everything they have done for me. Then I looked at him. What about you? What are you going to do with your money, Bill? Oh, I know exactly what I'll do, he said confidently. I'll use it to move back to Colorado and open my own accounting firm. I really wanted to say something at that moment, but I held back. It was easy to express my feelings the day before because Buffalo Bill was too much of a gentleman to make the first move without my initiative. But what I wanted now had to come from him. I bit my lower lip, hesitating. Listen, Annie, he began. Do you want, I mean, would you come with me, Annie? Unless, of course, that's what you want. Oh, yes, Bill, I answered warmly. I want this more than anything in the world. And then she kissed him as hard as she could. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.